What do you think courage is? Charging forward without fear, speaking the loudest, standing the tallest, deciding faster than everyone else. But what if true courage is standing still, standing on the threshold when every path leads to loss, standing in the silence of the morning when the first step should not yet be taken? Bushido calls this not recklessness, but the willingness to act after reflection. How many times have you called your haste bravery? And how many times has the right kind of silence saved you from a mistake that could never be undone? The morning arrived earlier than usual. A thin wash of light slipped across the wooden veranda, too weak to warm anything, just enough to mark the end of night. On the steps leading down to the training yard, he stood still, not from hesitation, but from weighing each step. He was a young samurai in an age where honor was often mistaken for speed. People praised those who drew their blades quickly, decided hastily, spoke with force. He was different. He came from a quiet beginning, no glory, no named exploits. The only thing he carried was a habit of observing one beat longer than everyone else. The surroundings were not harsh. An old wooden dojo, a familiar yard, faces he saw every day. But inside, everything was drawn tight like a boot. Every morning repeated the same choice: step down those stairs, or turn back inside and let the day pass like all the others. He did not name what troubled him. He only knew that each time he heard other footsteps rush ahead too early, his hand tightened, not from fear of being left behind, but from the understanding that an unconsidered action leaves a longer mark than a miscut blade. In Bushido, you is not for the impatient. It belongs to those clear enough to know when to advance and when to stand. And on that morning, in the brief silence before the day truly began, he remained on the steps, allowing wisdom to walk ahead of courage once more. The incident happened on another morning, when the steps were still damp with dew and the silence had not yet lifted. The order was given quickly, decisive, leaving no time for questions. A minor confrontation, they called it. An opportunity to prove oneself. That was the phrase used. The footsteps around him left the steps almost at the same moment. The wood creaked softly under hurried weight. Swords were drawn faster than thought. He did not follow immediately. He did not retreat. He stood still, his gaze lowered toward the yard, where everything was moving too fast to leave room for consideration. The moment did not last long, but it was long enough to create a fracture. When the confrontation ended, someone was injured. No one died, yet the looks directed at him had changed. No accusations were spoken, only a silence heavier than usual, stories whispered behind his back, footsteps that deliberately quickened when passing by. The crisis did not come from an obvious failure, but from a question left hanging. Was standing still a form of avoidance? Was deliberation seen as weakness on a path that glorified immediate action? Every morning afterward, when light once again spilled across the wooden veranda, the steps were still there, but the feeling beneath his feet had changed. It was no longer only a personal choice, it had become the weight of collective judgment. There was a moment, amid the noise of the training yard, when he stood still once more, not stepping forward to prove himself, not turning away to withdraw, just standing, accepting the consequences of not merging with the rhythm of haste. And in that stillness, the question took clearer shape than ever before. If courage is not understood, is it still worth holding on to? The change did not arrive in a loud moment. It came on a morning quieter than all the others. When the training yard was still empty and the steps held onto the night's lingering chill, he arrived early, not to train, but to stand there longer than usual. Someone appeared behind him. He did not need to turn to know who it was. The aging master, slow of step, unarmed. The man did not ask why he was standing still. He simply stood beside him, both gazing down at the empty yard. The silence lasted long enough for the morning itself to say what needed to be said. Then the master spoke, lightly, as if making a passing observation. There are strikes that are meant to be delivered, and there are moments that are meant for the sword to remain sheathed. Not everyone can tell the difference. He did not look at him. He did not wait for an answer. He walked away, leaving the steps to him alone. The words did not feel like advice. They felt like a mirror. For the first time, he realized that what made others doubt him was not his stillness, but the fact that he had not yet been steady enough to stand still completely. It was not the avoidance of action. It was the courage to take responsibility for a decision examined to its very end. That morning, he placed his foot on the step in a different way. Not faster, not slower, just clearer. His resolve was no longer about proving anything to others. It was about this. From that moment on, whenever he stood still or stepped forward, he would no longer allow haste to borrow the name of courage, not even once. The first morning began before the birds. Darkness still clung to the roof of the dojo and the steps were colder than usual. He woke while everything in him still wanted to stay. There was no call, no one watching, only a dense silence thick enough to hide every excuse for delay. He sat up, paused, not from fatigue, but to let his breathing settle. When his feet touched the floor, the cold rose clearly, sharper than the vague thoughts drifting through his mind. He stepped onto the veranda. The morning promised nothing. It offered only a small choice. Step down onto these stairs, or turn back inside and call it just another day. The first step landed slow and firm. There was no grand victory, only a quiet act of self. He stood still for one beat, then continued. Each step was not meant to prove resolve, but to test whether it truly existed when no one was there to witness it. The days that followed repeated the same hour, the same steps, the same half-lit mornings. Fatigue was never named. It showed itself in the way he sat longer before rising, then rose anyway. The first real victory was not in muscle or technique. It lay in this, within that silence. He no longer bargained with himself. The mornings that followed no longer felt like trials. They grew so similar to one another that they were hard to distinguish. The same steps, the same yard still heavy with dew, the same sound of footsteps echoing in silence. There were no milestones to mark progress, only repetition stretching far longer than he had first expected. He practiced the most basic movements, nothing added, nothing removed. The sword rose, fell, then rose again. His breathing stayed even. Time passed without offering any sense of novelty. On some mornings he stood still in the middle of the yard longer than usual, not to rest, but because he noticed his mind searching for a reason to change the routine, to break the monotony. He didn't name it. He recognized it only through small signs, the hand slowing, the gaze drifting from its fixed point. Then he brought it back, not with a surge of determination, but by continuing with the next movement. His footprints in the packed earth did not grow deeper with each day, but they appeared consistently, without missing a single morning. Gradually, repetition stopped being an enemy. It became a measure. Each time he stepped down the stairs in the dim light, the question was no longer whether he should train or not. The only question left was this: today, was he awake enough to do again what he had done yesterday without needing a different feeling to justify it? The storm arrived without warning. That morning was darker than usual. Wind pressed hard against the dojo roof. Rain slanted across the familiar yard. The steps were slick and cold, and silence was torn apart by uneven impacts of wind and water. He paused one beat longer before stepping down, not to consider turning back inside, but to adjust how his first step would land. Training did not stop. The sword felt heavier in the rain. His clothes clung to his body, restricting every movement. Each motion had to slow, not from weakness, but to preserve balance. At times, he stood still in the middle of the yard, wind blowing straight into his face, eyes open, body steady, waiting only long enough to continue without losing alignment. There was no thought of conquering the weather, only the refusal to let it decide for him. In the days that followed, conditions shifted constantly, cold, wet, then harsher still. The body reacted first, sluggish, weighed down. He did not name what was happening inside him. It revealed itself through smaller breaths, through stopping at the exact moment when pressing on would have meant losing control. In the midst of the storm, he understood something the calm mornings had never taught him. Courage is not found in enduring at all costs, but in the ability to keep the mind clear when everything around you urges excess. When the storm passed, the steps were still there, and his footsteps slow, steady returned again the next morning. After the days of storm, everything became unusually comfortable. The mornings were clearer, the training yard dry, the steps no longer slick. The familiar rhythm returned, but this time it carried a subtler temptation. The feeling that he had done enough. There were invitations that were never spoken, glances suggesting a shorter path, lighter training, a quicker way to demonstrate progress. No one forced him. Ease itself was the test. He recognized it when his steps slowed before the stairs, not from fatigue, but from a thought that surfaced briefly, then slipped away. He stood still, not to avoid the work, but to observe what had just tried to enter. Then he stepped down into the yard and kept the same routine, the same pace. The sword rose and fell as it always had, no added flourish, no shortened time. Each time he held to the principle under easy conditions. The choice became clearer than it ever was in hardship. Unyielding spirit does not reveal itself in moments of tension. It shows itself when no one is watching, when there is no obvious reason to try harder. In the quiet of the morning, he understood that holding discipline in comfort is far more difficult than enduring it in the storm. And it was there that courage began to take on a steady form. No longer dependent on circumstance. The morning arrived more gently, not because it was easier, but because it had become familiar. He stepped onto the veranda just as the light touched the first stair. There was no longer any inner negotiation. His foot came down naturally, without force and without reminders. Silence was no longer a test. It had become a firm ground on which every action could fall into its proper place. Discipline had left the shape of effort. It became the way he was present. Those around him began to notice, not through stories, but through the steady rhythm of his mornings. Not faster than anyone, not slower, simply consistent. As if the stairs and his steps had finally found each other after a long time apart. He did not stand above others, but when decisions were needed, his silence created a space for reconsideration. Any sense of radiance did not come from showy victories. It came from this: in the quiet of the morning, there was someone steady enough to act at the right moment, and lucid enough not to act when the time had not yet arrived. The trial arrived on a morning that seemed ordinary. The training yard was more crowded, the rhythm of footsteps more hurried. A situation arose quickly enough to pull every gaze in a single direction. A decision had to be made immediately, they said. There was no time to think. They believed. He stepped toward the stairs, then stopped. He did not move forward. He did not retreat. Silence stretched for exactly one breath. In that brief interval, every option appeared at once. Act immediately to prove resolve, or hold position to consider the consequences that would follow. If he chose wrong, everything could be arrest: the mornings, the footsteps, the discipline on in a single moment. He did not look around for agreement. He looked only at the yard, where the consequences of the decision would unfold. Then he stepped down, unhurried, not to delay, but to place each foot precisely where it needed to be. The sword was drawn when necessary, and held back when the moment had not yet arrived. The action unfolded no faster than anyone else's, yet without a single wasted movement. When it was over, there was no cheering, only another silence, deeper than before. This time, no one questioned him. But one question remained left for whoever is listening to this story now. If you were standing on that stair, under the pressure to act immediately, would you have the courage to wait one more breath to think? After that trial, nothing changed in any obvious way. The dojo was the same. The training yard still opened each morning. The steps remained motionless between the wooden veranda and the familiar ground below, but the way he existed within those spaces had shifted. Morning arrived, and he no longer came early to conquer himself. He came because this was where he needed to be. His footsteps carried none of the tension of having to prove anything. They sounded steady just enough to set the rhythm for a day to begin in the right place. Silence was no longer an opposite force to action. It had become the opening to it. Those around him never named the change. They sensed it in the way moments of decision grew clearer when he was present. Not because he spoke more, but because he spoke less. Not because he moved more slowly, but because each action arrived exactly when it should. Haste could no longer borrow the shape of courage. When standing beside him, he understood that he had not become a new person in the usual sense. There was no moment of rebirth, only a consistency held long enough to quietly cover the person he once was. Courage was no longer separate from wisdom. It lived in his ability to stand still when needed, and to step forward when there was nothing left to consider. Bushido calls you courage, but not the loud kind. It is the ability to stand on the step each morning, before the foot has been set down, and remain silent long enough for wisdom to move ahead of action. Moving forward is not always courage, and standing still is not always weakness. Perhaps the hardest thing is not acting, but waiting one more beat to reflect. When you face the next choice in your life, what will you call courage? Stepping forward immediately, or holding the silence until the true path reveals itself? If this story makes you pause a little longer one morning, keep that moment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue journeys like this, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and walk the steps ahead with greater awareness, one step at a time.